No, this isn't a mini iPhone or half of an iPhone. It's actually a digital camera. Clearly, it's a novelty item, but it's something that you can find now on sites including Amazon and Temu for around $40. And based on the price, you can definitely tell it's more of a toy camera, not to be taken super seriously, but the design I thought was just so interesting, maybe in a kind of ridiculous way, that I just wanted to take a closer look. And it can also be used, in fact, as a digital audio player or a DAP. You can load music on it. It includes a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. That being said, if we look more closely, this camera is filled with some interesting contradictions. For example, it touts a 3-inch OLED display, except it's not. It's just an IPS LCD screen. And also, it touts up to 64 megapixels 4K video recording, except based on the image quality that you'll see in a moment, it is likely interpolated from something like a 2 or 3 megapixel sensor, so it's still going to be quite grainy. Not to mention a description here that says it is equipped with 3 lenses and a CCD plus CMOS sensor with a 0.76 times viewfinder. I'm honestly not even sure what that's trying to say, if I'm going to be honest, and it's unlikely that it has both CMOS and CCD sensors, which haven't been used in compact point-and-shoots for well over a decade at this point. So yeah, definitely take this with a grain of salt. But there are other aspects which are actually true. For example, at first when I saw the design, I was thinking of some of the iPhone clones or generic devices from a couple of years ago that looked like it had 2 camera lenses, but one of the lenses was fake. But surprisingly, on this camera, you actually have 3 functioning camera lenses, which I definitely was not expecting. There's that primary, which has autofocus, and then a secondary, which is 2 times zoom lens, getting you just a little bit closer, though definitely not as much as the 16 times that it's advertised to do on the packaging. Again, we'll see more samples later on, and this is a fixed focus lens. And then the third lens is on the front. There's actually a selfie camera on there, just like on a smartphone. So again, if you aren't coming in with the highest expectations, maybe giving it to a kid or using it as a backup music player, then I guess it can still be all right. Although something else that's a little funny in this picture is it shows a zoomed in view, except the touchscreen here does not support pinch to zoom. There is no multi-touch in the Java-based operating system that it's running on, so you can't even use the gesture that they're indicating here to zoom into your shots. It does also have a built-in, again, microphone for video, so it can be used as a voice recorder as well, with relatively compact dimensions, although the screen-to-body ratio is also going to be much weaker compared to some of the advertisements where they kind of stretch the screen out a little bit more to make it seem like it's more immersive. The bezel size on the real thing is much chunkier. Anyways, on the product box here, I have to say the size also took me by surprise because this is a tiny little box. When it came in the mail, I thought something was actually wrong because the size of the camera barely fits inside of this box. But we can see it comes in colors of black and white, and what's kind of funny is on the side here, instead of saying OLED, they actually used LOLED touch. So maybe they're trying to blur the lines between IPS LCD screen and OLED, creating their own terminology. And also on the front, they're calling it the PowerShot D6. So I guess they're trying to also draw references to some Canon cameras. Maybe they should have called it something like a iTouch camera instead. But at least one aspect which is true here on the side is it does have a real metal frame and a actual glass back cover. So surprisingly, the build quality is a little bit heavier and more premium feeling when you're first picking it up than expected for just a toy $40 camera, along with, again, having 3 actually functioning camera lenses are the 2 aspects which are a little surprising here. Anyways, inside of the packaging, if you opt for one that comes bundled with a micro SD card, you'll find that thrown in, and you can pop it into the side slot here, which at first I was also thinking maybe my unit is defective because it looks like it's just fully revealed, a little ugly there, until I discovered underneath there's actually a little door that you can pop onto it with a screw. Honestly, I don't think I've seen a design like this ever before, but you can choose to leave it open or, again, seal it off more securely. And there's a tiny little screwdriver inside here as well, along with a microfiber cleaning cloth, a pretty typical USB Type-C cable for charging and data transfer, along with also a lanyard strap. And there's even a full-size USB Type-A to Type-C converter if you want to transform that cable into Type-C to Type-C for more modern laptops or even looking at the images on a phone. But here's the thing, despite looking like a tiny iPhone, there are no additional wireless connectivity options. There's no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, so you can't really connect it to wireless headphones for music. You have to use the wired wired port, and also of course, no SIM card slot for making phone calls. Just keep that in mind. Now, the boot up animation is also kind of hilarious because it is, again, clearly inspired by Apple products, to the point where it has a hello logo also in kind of a retro Macintosh inspired font. And here we have that 3-inch IPS LCD screen, so blacks aren't going to be as inky as a real OLED panel. I think that's actually a little bit of a shame because these days you can find some low-cost smartwatches or fitness trackers start to use real OLED displays. So I was thinking maybe they did the same thing on this camera, except that was still unfortunately an exaggeration. Again, the bezels here are definitely chunky, but we find the front-facing selfie lens with the rounded icons also reminiscent of iOS. However, it's definitely more choppy than modern Android or iPhones that it's trying to imitate. For example, you can actually swipe here to change the wallpaper, but it's very jumpy. Although there are a couple which are rather cute and I do kind of like, including this cat one, which is maybe inspired by Studio Ghibli, kind of adorable, and other ones which are inspired by cartoon themes or more landscape-oriented designs can also be found. At least the viewing angles aren't that bad because it is a IPS screen, although brightness is a little lacking, so if you're using this in glaring sunlight, it is going to be a little hard to see. And also, if you accidentally touch the screen, you can see how the wallpaper also quickly flashes through. And on the bottom, we can jump into the camera UI, which we can also do just by pressing on the camera shutter key. You can tap on this icon to switch between the 3 lenses. By default, it's using the primary autofocus enabled lens, which is the highest quality lens on this camera. You can half press to focus and then all the way down to snap a shot. Unfortunately, even though we do have a real metal frame and a glass back that feels decent, the buttons are a little bit on the cheap and loose side. For example, that shutter key is really overly responsive when you half press, but somehow also mushy and unresponsive when you want to fully press down. Despite this being a new camera, there's already been times where I was unable to take a picture using this button because it got jammed halfway. Not to mention, if we look really closely, unfortunately, it seems like the battery cover is already starting to lift up on the left side. It's kind of skewed, and if I press down on it, it actually doesn't do anything either. So either the battery inside is starting to get spicy and expand like a pillow, or it just hasn't been glued in properly, but nonetheless, you can't even really push it down all the way, resulting in kind of a mushy experience. And if we had to look really closely, what seems like a frosted glass finish is actually just a sticker. So it is made out of real glass, but to create this other texture, you can see the bubble here starting to peel a little bit, and that's how they created this slightly different finish instead of actually etching over the glass material. It's kind of like a screen protector or film on top of the glossy part of the glass, which is kind of funny. Aside from the 2 camera lenses, by the way, there is a LED flash, just like on a phone camera, so it's not going to be nearly as bright as a true xenon flash used on regular point-and-shoots. And you can also find, interestingly enough, 2 infrared lights, which is at least one specialty function that is, I think, a little bit more useful and I wasn't really expecting. So you can actually shoot in the dark, kind of like a security camera, except it switches into a black and white view. The metal frame, although feeling solid, is a bit of a fingerprint magnet, not too surprising because it is very shiny, and you'll find access to the Type-C port, loudspeaker, 3.5mm headphone jack, a lanyard strap, as well as a full tripod thread, which is actually nice to see here, and then just that shutter plus power key on the very top. Anyways, coming back to the UI, we can tap again to switch into the front-facing selfie camera, which is at least functional, but this one is fixed focus, and you can tap again to go into the 2x digital zoom crop. So this is what that looks like. Again, it's fixed focus, so you can't really take macro with it. However, you can see that difference compared to that primary lens, just getting you a little bit closer. You can also activate a digital zoom on the main sensor, although that will further reduce the detail, and you can tap here to bring up some additional shortcut options, including flash. So we can activate it, and now it just will illuminate this back plate. Again, it's not the brightest thing, but I guess better than nothing. And also tap again to activate the infrared light, which is invisible to the human eye but can be picked up by the camera in the dark. Also, that LED glow kind of makes the back cover light up in at least kind of an interesting way, in my opinion, versus the aforementioned IR bulb mode. We have those 2 little beads, again, that are only seen by the camera lens. The only problem is that these lights are pretty far away from the actual lens, so they don't illuminate very far at all, which means you have to press objects really close to the camera for it to even see in the dark, which is definitely a shame because, again, those IR bulbs are functional. It just needs to be brighter and closer to the main lens for it to be more functional in seeing further away. So so not the best performance there, unfortunately. What you can also activate here is going to be a countdown timer functionality. You can mute the kind of focus tones, and also activating a beauty mode, as you can tell there, that will slightly increase the exposure, reducing some of the blemishes on a face, and that is it. So you don't have access to other scene modes or filter modes like black and white, curiously enough. You can also tap on this corner here to begin recording video, so quite basic. Swiping up from the middle of the screen using that gesture, like on most modern phones and tablets, will take you back to this main home screen. And from here you're able to review some of your sample shots, and what's funny is on this tiny 3-inch screen, the images actually don't look all that bad. The problem is when you start to blow them up onto a larger computer screen, it starts to deteriorate very quickly, even though we are shooting currently in the 12 megapixel mode. But in my testing, regardless of what resolution I'm choosing, it's really just modifying the dimensions of the photo. The actual resolution isn't really changing, so you're not going to get that much detail. It isn't a real 64 megapixel sensor, unfortunately. That being said, you can see the difference there between the regular versus 2 times secondary zoom lens, and at least that main lens with autofocus is functional, although it's not going to be the most accurate in every single instance. This is a quick test of the video recording capabilities on this iPhone-inspired mini digital camera. So unfortunately, the overall quality isn't that radically different from a Wacom camera or just one of those tiny little retro snap cameras that we also saw likely has a very similar sensor. That is a shame though, because this thing does have, again, real autofocus that many of the other models there were lacking. Those were fixed focus lenses. So this has the potential to get a little bit sharper if you are putting objects closer to the camera lens. That can be demonstrated in this example here. I'm trying to focus on this little bottle of water, and you can see that the text is relatively clear, while at the same time the background is defocused with a little bit of separation. Of course, not a ton of bokeh at the end of the day, but you can tell it's sharper compared to the computer screen. So that is the benefit of having a working autofocus lens compared to being fixed focus like the other toy cameras that we've seen in the past. Another example can be seen here. I'm focusing on this text, and the background starts to get a little bit more out of focus. So the autofocus part really is true, and I think does make a difference. At least it is a little bit more functional there. It's just, sadly, the resolution of the sensor isn't there, so as you start blowing up these images, they start to fall apart, even though it looks half decent on this tiny screen. With that being said, it's lacking any HDR capabilities, and so if you're in challenging lighting conditions, such as a backlit scene, it's definitely going to struggle more. You don't really have any of those processing capabilities on this camera. These remarks are sadly echoed on the video performance as well. There is no optical stabilization, and again, with such a low resolution for the actual sensor, around 2 megapixels, you're just not going to get as good performance, unfortunately, compared to even many entry-level or mid-range phones these days. Now, you are able to delete photos just by long pressing on the shutter key for a couple of seconds in the preview screen, and you're able to, again, either delete it from storage or set it as a wallpaper. The next tab over is going to be music, and from here you can load back any MP3s, WMA tracks from the micro SD card, and it will load it back. Although the UI views are unfortunately quite limited. You can't see a full list of all the songs. You have to cycle back and forth track by track, which is a little tedious. So it's actually not that bad, and obviously for best music quality you want to use the headphone jack if you wanted to listen to music on your camera, which by the way isn't so crazy of a concept actually. Back in the day, Samsung, when they made their Digicams, actually experimented on their NX line with functions like music playback in addition to taking photos. Of course, these features have been mostly superseded by our modern day smartphones, but it is kind of an interesting callback to that time, also the iPod Touch. Now the next one here is going to be the voice recorder. So now we're recording sound using the microphone. Test, 1, 2, 3. Pretty basic, but you are able to play back those tracks. Recording sound using the microphone. Test, 1, 2. Now, last but not least, if we jump into the main settings here, we can find some typical options, including language, as well as the beauty level there if you're using the beauty mode. Touchscreen calibration can be readjusted, and also time and date can be set from here. That being said, it seems like the time information on the main homepage is always going to be in the 24-hour format. It does not seem to have a 12-hour view, so just keep that in mind as well. We can further swipe down to change, again, the wallpaper options that we saw there on the main screen just by cycling across, kind of like a budget smartwatch. And if we jump into the camera section, this is where we can change the resolution, although again, it doesn't really make that big of a difference, unfortunately. The minimum 3 megapixels is pretty much the actual sensor inside this thing. Similarly for video, you can go all the way up to 4K, but it doesn't actually make that big of a difference in quality versus 720, unfortunately, on this model. Though you do have a cyclic record function, so it will actually loop over kind of like a dash cam if the memory gets full. So that has been this D6, clearly iPhone inspired, I would say welcome style camera. And honestly, I picked this up for laughs and giggles, trying to find out what's real and what's not. Because I was not expecting the IR night vision mode, as well as the 3 lenses to be actually functional, which they are, including that main autofocus lens. That's actually a little bit better compared to most other fixed lens budget digicams on the market, like the Retro Snap, the Camp Snap even. These are all fixed lens cameras, meaning have to stand at least, I would say, a feet away from an object to get it to be in focus, better for landscape shots, whereas this has a little bit more versatility. It's just, sadly, the sensor underneath is so low resolution, really only 3 megapixels, that everything just looks a bit fuzzy if you're blowing them up on a larger display. So kind of a mixed bag, I would say, but still interesting nonetheless, at least from a design perspective. Actually not the worst welcome camera that we've seen, again, in terms of that autofocus capability, and if you're using it as, I suppose, a backup music player, although there are definitely better dedicated DAPs or audio players we've seen, giving you more options compared to this thing is just quite basic. I would honestly say a better value might be just using your phone camera, or even a lower cost phone cam can likely produce better quality images with a higher resolution real sensor inside. Or if you are trying to get a dedicated point and shoot camera with a real functioning shutter button, then a better idea, in my opinion, would be getting a real Digicam from the 2000s, an authentic model from Canon, Panasonic's Lumix series, or even a Sony Cybershot that this thing is trying to imitate will of course give you much better quality images and a real optical zoom. Of course, those units likely will be used at this point in time, but still can be found for not that much more, even maybe less if you are shopping around on sites like eBay. So just keep that in mind. But anyways, this is more of just a fun look, I guess, at a quirky camera that caught my eye when browsing around. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That has been the D6 point and shoot Digicam.